A reading from Genesis chapter 28. Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there for the night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord your God, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring, and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob woke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, but the name of that city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this his stone, which shall be set up as a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you. Here ends the readings. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Many of you know that Thelma and I had just gotten back from a fishing trip to the Catskills of New York. It was ostensibly billed as a fly fishing trip, but in reality, it was to take a break from the striving that we have gone through to help church go virtual over the last 3 months, but also to take a step backwards and to think through what our continuing response to the COVID-19 outbreak might be, as well as to take into consideration the economic uncertainty that we're living in, and to take stock and reflect on the riots that we have seen in our cities over racial upheaval. Really, the week was to take a step back and think and ask the question, what's next for First Congregational Church? And as we were searching through the region, following the rivers, looking for that one perfect fishing hole in which we could dangle our lines for a trout, it brought to mind another trip some years ago in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado, where Thelma and I packed up our SUV and canoe trailer with all the things in the tent we would need for a week surviving in the high country. And yes, we had a wonderful time in our canoe fishing the high mountain alpine lakes around Lake City. And when we weren't fishing in the canoe, driving down the back roads looking for that one special pool where that Rocky Mountain trout might live. And as we were doing that, we came across several ghost towns that surprised us. And there's a backstory to that. Back in 1876, gold was discovered in the San Juan Mountains, as well as silver, and overnight, bustling mining communities erupted into being. And it was that way until about 1893, when the gold had panned out and the market for silver went through the bottom. And overnight, these towns were just abandoned. People left their belongings and just moved away. And so today, you can walk through many of these settlements. You can walk through saloons. You can walk through hotels. You can walk through the assay offices and see the tools that people left behind. You could walk through the mine works and the ore works and still see the ore carts on their trolley tracks going into the mine face in the mountain. And in one of those towns at about 11,000 feet in altitude, we ran into a small chapel. We knew it was a chapel because it had a small steeple and a crooked cross on the top of it. And we stood there and wondered that in the midst of all this raucous business of a boisterous mining town in the late 19th century in the American West, yet still somebody recognized that they were actually living in a thin place, In Celtic Christianity, a thin place is one of those places where one senses the reality of the spirit, the spiritual realm moving very deeply in our own midst. Indeed, as we took a step backwards and looked around and saw that we were in a valley ringed by mountains rising up to 14,000 feet, it was an awesome place. And we recognized that, yes, even in the midst of all that busyness and noise, people recognized that God was there. When the fishing trip was done, we didn't go straight home. Instead, we continued southwest to the southwest corner of the San Juans where they met the desert. And there is a place called Mesa Verde. And a completely different experience was awaiting for us there. We toured the mesas and we saw from the distance many of the cliff dwellings. We got a ticket to go into Cliff Palace. But we were totally unprepared for the experience of going down the stairs and the ladders and rounding the corner to come up against that settlement. We were amazed at the size of the blocks that were used to construct the buildings. And as we went through the complex, with the guide telling us about what life was like in this particular settlement, and saw the number of kivas, small circular excavations in the ground that were sacred spaces, meeting places where ceremonies were held, again, we understood that we were in a thin place, suspended between the canyon floor and the mesa tops above, where the culture there had cultivated their corn. And down later in the day, when we got to the visitor center at Spruce Tree House, we were able to walk through a settlement that was more or less reconstructed by archaeologists. And there was a kiva there with a roof that you could climb down into to get some of the experience of what it was like being in this sacred space. And I remember sitting there alone in the dark, looking at the holy place, or the altar by the hearth, and the ladder that went up through the roof, and the intense light that came through the ceiling where the ladder went through, thinking to myself, yes, this is indeed another one of those thin places where spirituality is felt very strongly. And the whole scene reminded me of the story in Genesis of Jacob that we read this morning, of Jacob fleeing his family because he's stolen his brother's birthright. His brother is in a murderous rage, and so he has to get out of town. But he is uncertain about where he is going. He's been sent by his mother to his uncle Laban, his mother's brother. But Laban's reputation precedes him. Laban, like Jacob, is a trickster and a thief. And Jacob's life is far from certain as he goes forward. And so he is in this thin place of uncertainty and finds himself dreaming as he goes to sleep at night of a ladder going up to heaven with angels descending on it and ascending into heaven. And God sitting next to him, saying to him, promising to him, no matter where you go, no matter where you end up, I will be with you. It is just the word of hope and certainty that Jacob needs. When Jacob wakes up the next morning, he recognizes that this is God's house, in Hebrew, Beth-El, and he christens that before he moves on in the rest of his journey. We know about thin places. We know about God's house, Beth-El. Our own sanctuary is one of those places. I remember first seeing pictures of it on the internet before I came to visit. But none of those pictures prepared me for the experience of walking into that sanctuary and feeling it for myself. And the minute I did, I knew this was indeed another one of those thin places where people profoundly meet to meet God and to encounter God and to have an experience that transforms and gives definition to their lives. Our sanctuary is one of those sacred thin places. Some would even say that it is so sacred that the membrane between heaven and earth there is so thin that we even have our own guardian angel who is seen out of the corner of the eye every once in a while by a few people. But we are in a position where we cannot worship there for now. We are cut off from our Bethel, from our house of God, from our thin space. And it puts me in the mind of asking myself, what are the other thin spaces in my life? And I have to confess, one of the reasons I am so avid about fly fishing, it's not so much that I like catching fish, but it's that every time I step into the water with my waders and feel the tug of the water wanting to carry me downstream, I get this sense of a spirituality of immersion in which I am carried in a flow far greater than myself. And so every time I step into the water, I'm reminded of the promises that were made at my baptism, and understand that as I step into the water, I am stepping into holy water. And yes, we have water that we call holy that we put into our font, which we use to baptize people. But let's face it, that water that we call holy in our font does not make the rest of all water on earth profane and subject to abuse and pollution. The water that we use in baptism speaks to the sacred nature, the holiness of all water. And so every time I step into the water with my fishing rod, I step into this flow of spirituality and understand that I am walking into one of those thin places where I am likely to meet God. And as I take a step back from that experience and reflect on theology, it occurs to me that many of our major doctrines that we have in the church are really attempts to talk about in sophisticated ways those thin places in which we meet God. We have a doctrine around Holy Communion, where in many of our Christian traditions, the bread and the wine, once they become consecrated, become holy elements, special bread, special wine, for this unique meeting and this unique meal that we have with God. But I don't think that the holiness of the bread or the holiness of the wine really says that the rest of food and drink is profane. I think the proper way to understand it is to say that as we consecrate this bread and this wine as holy, so we understand that all food and all drink are holy. And that gathering together around the table in Holy Communion is not just a way for us to celebrate community in God's presence, but every time we sit down at table with someone, it is a sacred experience. Every time I sit at the table with my family, I do understand our meal as a sacred meal. And I hope one day when this COVID-19 outbreak is over and we can freely gather again, that when we gather at the table, every time we do so, we recognize it as a supremely holy experience, one of those thin places. Perhaps the greatest doctrine that we have in Christianity is the doctrine of the Incarnation, which is our way of trying to talk about how Jesus was fully caught up in the divine, how God fully enveloped his humanity and upheld it, making Jesus' life holy. And I think a lot of times we take an incorrect direction when we look at the holiness of the life of Jesus and say that unless we are redeemed in his life, all other human life is profane. I think that's a mistake. I think we would do better to recover the understanding of the early church that said he became like us, that we might become like him. The holiness, the sanctity of the life of Jesus is not meant to be sort of a contradiction to the rest of life. It's not meant to put down all other human life as being profane, but to lift up all human life as being sacred, as being beloved by God, as being a gift of God. And if all human beings are sacred in God's sight, then how dare we exploit them, oppress them, abuse them? The older I get, the more I am convinced that thin places are everywhere and at every time. Every place has the potential to be a place where heaven bends down and kisses the earth. Every time has the potential to be a time of intense spiritual encounter. And so now that we are exiled for a time from our sacred thin space of our sanctuary, I wonder, where is it that we meet God? Can we unleash our imaginations to see God in all possibilities, in all places, and in all times? Can we unleash our imagination to see God very present with us? And can we unbind our hearts to embrace those moments? So what are those moments for you? Where in these days do you see God? Where in these days does God encounter you? Where in these days are you lifted up and supported by God? And I can think back on my life and think of countless times and of countless places, none of them particularly special. I remember a time after an interview with Eden Theological Seminary that was going to determine whether I was admitted or not, and I was, and on my way driving back home, somehow the cornfields were just that bit more luminous. It's a thin place. It can happen anywhere, anytime. And until we come back together again, I invite you to think about those places. Whether it's a sunset in a special place, whether it's an embrace with a loved one, whether it's a word that you hear someone utter, whether it's the laughter or cry of a child. Unleash your imaginations and open your hearts to see that, yes, even there, God is with us. God promises to be with us and to uphold us. As we continue this journey, may you see God day to day, hour to hour, minute by minute. May you know that you are loved and precious in God's sight. Amen.